Now we continue to read the divorce case of Mrs. Moureen Sinclair versus Mr. Wesfore Sinclair. This is submission on behalf of the defendant, Mr. Sinclair. Counsel for the defendant, Ms. Lindsay, submits that from a preliminary point of view and pursuant to Section 13 of the Act, that's the Property Rights of Spouses Act, the claimant, that's Mrs. Sinclair's pursuit of the claim without the permission of the court may be preemptive, as there has been no grant of decree of dissolution of the marriage. The claim filed on July 30, 2019, prior to Mr. Sinclair's petition and amended petition for divorce, which were filed on January 6, 2020 and February 12, 2020, respectively. In answer filed to these proceedings, filed by the defendant, that's Mr. Sinclair, the claimant, Mrs. Sinclair, has stated that the defendant, Mr. Sinclair, is not entitled to the divorce which he seeks. Whilst it must be noted that the defendant, albeit opposing the application made herein, is not opposing the court exercising its discretion in hearing the matter. This preliminary point is, however, an important consideration of the claimant's, that's Mrs. Sinclair's, conduct when the court comes to consider the matter in which it will exercise its discretion in this case. She further submits, that's Mr. Sinclair's lawyer, further submits that the court should apply the 50% share rule to the Cherry Gardens property, as none of the Section 7 provisions of the Property Rights of Spouses Act is applicable. She relies on the case of Christian versus Christian to say that if it is that the spouse seeking to rebut the presumption cannot show that it would be unjust and unreasonable, the presumption will apply. That's a presumption, the 50-50% presumption. She also points out that the marriage was one of a relatively long duration. So you see here, Mrs. Sinclair doesn't want Mr. Sinclair to get anything from the property. But Mr. Sinclair may very well be entitled to 50%. Now, the length of marriage is going in support of Mr. Sinclair's 50%. Remember, it is Mrs. Sinclair's name that is on the title. So she's the owner of the property. And she wants everything in terms of the property. But anyway, we continue. Yes, so she also points out, that's Mr. Sinclair's lawyer, also points out that the marriage was of a relatively long duration and that the claimant, Mrs. Sinclair, has provided no evidence that there was any agreement between the parties in relation to the family home that is contrary to Section 6 presumption. So, the 50% share rule, there's nothing to go against it, to say that it doesn't apply in this case. Continue. She is of the view that there is no evidence presented by Mrs. Sinclair that the justice of the case requires a departure from the equal share rule. She urges the court to find that Section 6 of the Property Rights of Spouses Act applies and that both parties have a 50% interest in the family home. As it relates to the outstanding mortgage, she urges the court to find that with the joint and equal interest that both parties have in the family home comes the equal and joint responsibility for repayment of the mortgage registered thereon. So you see, Mrs. Sinclair's lawyer was saying before that Mr. Sinclair should be the only one to pay those mortgages. But now Mr. Sinclair's lawyer is saying that Mrs. Sinclair should pay half, repay half of those mortgages. We continue. Counsel takes issue with the fact that Mrs. Sinclair is seeking the sole ownership and equity in the property, yet seeking to distance herself from the liabilities attached to that property. So she wants the house, she wants the whole house, but doesn't want to pay anything for it. Further, she is of the view that's Mr. Sinclair's lawyer, is of the view that Mrs. Sinclair cannot stand in the position of knowing that Mr. Sinclair is encumbering himself with loans in constructing the family home befitting from the endeavor, and then say that she is solely entitled to the assets itself and not to its lawful expense. Well, that's what she's saying. She wants the whole house, but she doesn't want to pay for it. She submits that such a position is unjust and unreasonable, and she invites the court to reject Mrs. Sinclair's claim of being the sole legal owner of the property, free of all liens, charges, and encumbrances registered on the title.